hear me. And thank you again for attending this seminar. This is the first seminar of a series that we are organizing on tertiary education, and especially to discuss the current policy discussion in the country, the post-16 education and skills white paper, and also some insight from empirical work and international experiences. So over the next 7 weeks, we are going to be holding a weekly seminar on these topics every Thursday at this time. So you are more than welcome to join us during the next weeks. I also want to thank Lisa Wellaham and Gavin Modin for organizing and putting together a wonderful group of speakers for this seminar series. And our speaker today, I think many of you already know him. James Robson is director of SKOPE, also director of research here in the Department of Education in the University of Oxford, and is associate professor on tertiary education systems. And his work is focused mainly in the interaction between work, training, and education. And today he's going to present on the implications of this new post-16 education. So I'm going to leave it with him.
Thanks, Gonzalo. And thank you all for coming and attending. If I sit here, can I see you? Oh, hopefully. Can I be heard? Can you hear me online if I speak in this position?
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. Right, that's all right. Yeah, so thank you all for coming, and huge apologies for the delay in starting. That was because I wasn't here, because I was in a meeting. But thank you all. I'm really excited about this seminar series. I think talking about tertiary education now is a critical discussion to be having. So I'm hugely grateful to Gonzalo and Lisa and Gavin for putting this series together. And yeah, I'm really pleased to be part of it. I am going to talk about the white paper. I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about some of the ideas that sit behind it. There we go. So to just give you an overview of what I'm going to basically cover. Let's just start by briefly saying this is a really important policy time in the UK and in England specifically, and appreciate that not everybody in this room and on the call will necessarily be quite so excited and engaged with all of these sort of intricate policy developments and following them in detail. So to sort of start there by saying, yeah, we've got a Labour government, we've got a substantial shift in the discourse around politics in this country. It's taken them a little while to actually get their education and training policy agenda out. Or maybe it's taken them a while to get it together. But nevertheless, at the sort of tail end of last year, we did finally have released the white paper. So the post-16 education and skills white paper came out, and it really does, I think, set something of a policy agenda within this space. For those of you who haven't read it, and probably most of you haven't, even those wonks whose job it is to comment on this stuff probably haven't read it, or because it's actually quite wide-reaching. It's long, it covers an awful lot, which on the one hand is great. There's a lot of ambition potentially there. On the other hand, it's quite wide-ranging and perhaps is trying to say a little bit too much. But importantly, it fits, I think, within a wider ecosystem of policy documents and shifts and changes within this broader tertiary post-16 education and training space. So it sits alongside a curriculum review that took place last year. It is part of the broader sort of discussion around B levels, part of the wider discussion around the LLE. It's linked with the industrial strategy, fundamentally tied to the creation of Skills England. There's I think, not discussed enough document relating to LSIPs and the creation of, the need to update LSIPs by the summer of this year, as well as a quite fundamental shift of the adult skills agenda from DFE to DWP. And actually, just this week, we saw the International Student Strategy launched. There's lots going on, so the white paper doesn't stand on its own, but I think it is if not the critical document for this government's post-16 agenda. So what I'm going to do today is talk about it to a certain extent. I think critically it comes within a wider set of discourses that have come from academics and policy related commentators on the need for a more integrated tertiary system. That's why we're here today. So I really want to talk about whether this white paper actually represents and marks a meaningful transition to a tertiary education system in England. And I want to particularly focus on the word coordination and ideas around coordination and what that means. And so particularly looking at whether the white paper does represent a move towards a more coordinated tertiary system or not. And so through that, we'll talk a little bit about different conceptualizations of tertiary. And broadly speaking, the arguments will be that there is a really important political and rhetorical move that takes us into a post-marketisation space, takes us beyond sort of market mechanisms for managing post-16 sector. But that there are significant ambiguities, issues around governance, sector dynamics, role of employers, broader implementation issues, and that ultimately coordination is being treated as a technical delivery problem rather than what I think it needs to be, which is a fundamental political and institutional transformation. So you'll see here my final point. Might be floundering already, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. So let's start by just sort of talking about what is this post-16 space that has driven this conversation about tertiary. It's led to this white paper. What are the challenges that exist here? And ultimately, skills system, skills issues, post-16 education and training faces a number of chronic perennial challenges that I think all policymakers need to engage with us. These are the issues that sort of drive the conversation at a policy level at least. So always there's discussion around chronic skills gaps and shortages. That's a perennial issue and probably not going to dig into it in very much depth. It's linked with wider discussions around the productivity puzzle, the fact that productivity has stagnated in the majority of economies, to be honest, and that's linked to pretty much stagnant growth in most countries. And the view that skills are a key part of shifting development. The skill space, the education and training space, is also linked to wider issues around concerns about the NEET population, youth unemployment, the ways in which this intersects with welfare structures, the demographic pressures that always come into these debates. There's the perennial, I keep using that word, issue around labour market change. Constantly for decades, if not hundreds of years, there has been an emphasis on the fact that the nature of work is changing, skills needs are changing. At the moment, the focus is on technology, AI, and the way in which to shift skills needs in the country. There's also issues around climate geopolitics. And so debates around, well, how do we ensure a ready supply of skilled labour to meet the demands of a changing labour market? There's the constant, I think, challenge of what in the literature is often referred to some comfortably as the parity of esteem debate. So the difficulty that exists in terms of status and funding in the relationship between vocational pathways and academic pathways, vet, higher education. There's issues around qualifications and quality of education and training provision. And just to chuck it in there, issues around inequalities within society in terms of who gets into which parts of the education and training system and who progresses into which parts of the labour. These are, I think, probably not all of the kind of perennial challenges that exist within the post-16 debate, but it's a good place to start. But underpinning these or driving the sort of discussion around these are, I think, key questions that policymakers really end up trying to engage with. If they don't try it, then they should try it. And the first one is, how ultimately can post-16 education and training be structured and managed to drive both economic growth and support individual career aspirations and outcomes? So how do you structure the post-16 sector to link up with economic drives and demands, aspirations for growth, etc., and a whole raft of social issues? A good government should try and engage with both of those issues, economic and social, through discussions of education and training, in my view. And then perhaps a more technocratic question that underpins the discussion is, how to align skills supply with skill demand? Part of that changing nature of work, part of the shifting demands of the economy. How do you ensure that education is producing people who can function effectively in the economy? And then there's the third question is about quality of provision. Now, I think those three questions, I'm not up to debate these, absolutely fine, but I think those three questions sit at the heart of all of the broad policy conversations about post-16. It is important to note that there are other really, really important questions. Citizenship, democratic education, educational coherence, the education agenda, issues which I will touch on later about demand side reform, absolutely critical. But those three, I think, sit at the heart of the policy. So England's answer to these questions has, for the last few decades, essentially been rooted in marketisation and a laissez-faire growth model. So this sits within a broader political economy that since Thatcher, since Reaganomics, society in this country and in many countries has been dominated by a neoliberal agenda and fundamentally a market-based approach to the majority of social life. So post-16 education has been swept away in that really quite profound discursive change. So it's embedded within a broader framework, a broader political economy characterized by liberalization, deregulation, probably weak collective institutions within the labour market, and a strong emphasis on, and it's probably the most important point, on competition, flexibility, and individual responsibility. So part of this education and training has been linked with a growth model that is really based on labour market flexibility and responsibility for education and training. Skills outcomes shifted away from the state and to a perhaps more uncomfortable degree from employers, and fundamentally onto individuals, rooted in individual choice, individual aspirations, individuals navigating the labour market and from a human capital theory model, individuals investing in their own learning to maximise earning, and education and training providers. So, economic terms, the skills supply side. So, market-based income. This, in terms of those key questions, so skills alignment and quality of provision, the market is really seen as the core mechanism, the invisible hand of the market is seen as the core mechanism to ensure that there is appropriate alignment between supply and demand, and that the supply side responds to all kinds of signals to increase the quality of provision. That's the sort of fundamental where we've got to. Now, you can see this sort of playing out in the idea that ultimately institutions and sectors, so FE and HE, to a certain extent at least, compete for students and resources, and rooted and based on student choice, so students making a decision on what courses to do, what pathways to take, rooted in the idea that they have a particular aspiration for a particular kind of work, or choose particular courses, that will shape the nature of provision, and that's determined by and large by labour market signals. So how much employers pay graduates, whatever it may be, to come out of particular career pathways, rooted in skill shortages. Essentially, if you need work in a particular area, you pay more. So within this sort of marketized model, clearly the state acts as a market regulator with the idea that the key role is avoiding monopolies in the education and training space and ensuring that there aren't information asymmetries. So in the marketized model, the most important thing is making sure that the learner has enough information to make a relevant choice about that particular education and training pathway they might want to take. And by and large, that probably means information about the labour market. And that's why we saw, really, the creation of LEO, right? To create labour market data, earnings data that will inform student choice. Great in theory. But this gets tricky when students don't choose the courses that, by and large, policymakers think that they should. It's a bit tricky when the labour market doesn't actually provide clear signals about skills needs, and you can see that sort of messiness when there's constrained labour markets. You can see that messiness when, as a society, we value bankers over nurses, and the labour market rewards are very unequally distributed. And you can see that trickiness when ultimately employers don't really know what they need, what skills they need, and there's a fundamental lag in education and training and employers' demand. Education and training is always at the trailing edge of the skill system. There's always a massive delay. If you're talking about more advanced skills, you're looking at maybe 3, 4, 5 years. So there's always going to be this delay baked in, which is problematic and needs a more integral future orientation. So this, combined with a culture of centralization and a command and control model, as well as a broken funding system where actually a lot of the higher education discourses and FE discourses, by sort of as I experienced the tail end of that, are driven by a fear of unpaid student loan debt. We have that. We have culture ways, but I actually mean culture wars here. You have these weird culture wars that exist within the space, and particular politicians getting sucked into defining education and training in particular pathways as linked with particular political stance, as well as a tendency for regulatory overreach. What we have is not a market, it's not a pure market, it's a series of quasi where education and training essentially got a series of quasi markets or mutant markets where you've got a whole range of regulatory mechanisms and hands-off approaches from the state combined with really quite a lot of regulatory overreach and hands-on approaches from the DFE. And the result is, perhaps unsurprisingly, we'll come back, a mess. So this sort of messy space that we're in can really be seen in a variety of different ways. The first way, I think, is fundamentally through this sort of mutant market, this quasi-market, is a fixation on supply side interventions from a policy perspective. So this idea that you need to just keep tweaking, if we can only get the skill supply side right, then growth will get equality, we'll achieve proper social mobility, we'll raise productivity, etc., etc., etc. And that fixation on supply side intervention is manifested in just vast amounts of policy. So, as I've said here, in the last 14 years, Conservative government, you can see 10 secretaries of state for education, 2000s, just a formal policy shifts for just FE in England. We did 6 education acts, 9 reviews, 8 government strategy papers, and that's really just the tip of the iceberg in relation to the tweaks and the edits to the sector. So ultimately, what I think is a really important result of quasi-marketisation is initiative-itis that exists within education and training. So actually the whole sector, the whole post-16 space is in a constant state of reform. There's no chance for reforms to bed in, there's no chance for them to be evaluated, there's no chance for reflection, it's just this constant state of movement, intervention. And so inevitably this leads to instability, fragmentation. It leads to education training pathways that are confusing, hard to navigate for learners, hard to navigate for employers, funding systems are difficult for employers to understand. An education and training workforce that's subject to dealing with change, dealing with instability, leading to low morale. We have, through constant interventions in this initiative-itis, a qualifications jungle, particularly apparent within vocational education and training. And I think really importantly, what this sort of quasi-marketized approach with competition matched with significant regulation led to a homogenization of this space. So or using theoretical language, I define this in terms of a shift from horizontal diversity, where you've got a range of different sorts of pathways, vocational, higher education, different kinds of institutions, to vertical stratification, where ultimately what different institutions within and across vocational and higher education sectors do is imitate market leaders. So it's a homogenization of provision. People, through isomorphic tendencies, copying the market leader. And so the only distinction, rather than the sort of diversity and multiple pathways, is actually distinctions in terms of prestige. That's where the vertical stratification comes in. And our colleague here, Simon Marginson, has theorized this very nicely in a book on high participation systems. I strongly recommend people look into that. But that sort of fundamental shift, that narrowing of the offering in post-16 education training is, I think, a really insidious result of quasi-marketisation. The other really, I think, fundamentally problematic result of quasi-marketisation is the way in which the role of employers within post-16 has been structured and conceptualized. But ultimately, I think what quasi-marketisation sort of reveals is that market signals alone are insufficient to drive changes in skill supply and ensure alignment between supply and demand. So actually, information about skills needs, skills intelligence is critical. Fine, that's great. Yeah, I don't see any particular problem with that. Problem is that within this sort of approach, employers are positioned as driving fundamentally that conversation by becoming simply skills consumers within the space. They just come up with wish lists of skills, saying what they need, with the expectation that the supply side education training system will jump to those needs. The issue is that data is often really challenging, often presented as if the labour market is homogenous and doesn't really take into account the fundamental heterogeneity of within sector and cross-sector employers. And multiplicity of voices are often not heard within any kind of skills mapping exercise. This sort of approach to providing skills wish lists is often rooted in a particular model of short-termism from employers. They're often thinking about immediate needs for their own organizations. And a fear of poaching means that there's often significant over-specification to ensure that particular roles are really tied into very, very employer-specific needs. There's also the really important issue, I think, that doesn't get discussed enough, which is that there's a tendency within this model for employers to over-demand. It's built into the incentive structure for employers to over-demand skills, because that will stagnate wage growth. If there is an oversupply of people with particular skills, employers won't need to pay more. So fundamentally, baked into that system, there is an incentive for employers to over-demand linked with wage stagnation. I'm worried of time, so actually I'm not going to go on too much about this slide, but let me just say, lots of research done on issues around employers within this modern quasi-market-based approach that exists in post-16 education and training. And it sets up a fundamental tension between short-term employer needs rooted in, by and large, a profit-driven approach, and longer-term sectoral needs and perhaps societal, broader economic needs, which perhaps a state might have a more important and profound view over the kind of economy that we should be moving towards in the long term. So, where we were, shall we say, for the white paper, is a quasi-marketized world, which, in my view, is the worst of all. So actually, what this sort of quasi-marketized system, sector that we've had in England led to a lack of agility in terms of responding to skills needs. The structure of it has meant that there's a lack of diversity within education and training, which limits the ability of different providers to actually respond to shifts within the labour market. But it also means that structurally, there's not the provision for long-term planning for skills needs. It's not the provision for broader long-term thinking about industrial strategy, economic transition, or social. There's, through actually sort of the state stepping back I think it's created the conditions for a reduction discussion around the purposes of education and training to fundamentally only talking about short-term economic needs. So that whole piece about social needs, needs of individuals, whether that's sort of broader citizenship work or wider career aspirations, doesn't really gain much prominence with sorts of market mechanisms. And it's led to a fundamental removal of employer responsibilities within the system to one where employers just feel that they have rights, rooted in damaging competition between providers and sectors, homogenization, as I've mentioned, and fundamentally a siloed or siloing of working arrangements between all of the different parts of government and the different parts of the post-16 education and training system. So there are alternatives to a quasi model for arranging governance of post-16. And as I said at the outset, commentators and academics and a lot of the work that we've done in SKOPE has really emphasized a need towards framing post-16 using language of tertiary education system. And in fact, I think it's worth highlighting that I believe I was the first academic to receive the title of as Professor of Tertiary Education Systems as part of signalling actually SKOPE's view on the importance of taking a holistic approach. So thinking about what this might mean, there's a shift in the role of the state. We're not taking a market-based approach, then there's a potential more coordinating role for the state to get more actively involved in managing the relationship between skills, supply and demand, thinking more strategically about a wider range of social and economic issues and providing strategic oversight that takes us beyond short-term priorities of employers and short-term needs of the labour market and enables more longer-term strategic conversation. That would enable a greater discussion of particular sectors that might be linked with an industrial strategy, while also enabling broader collaborations to take place to remove a competitive element that's rooted in a market-based model, would enable greater collaboration to take place between education and training pathways and sectors, between TVET and HE, ensuring that there is a more diverse range of offerings. Key to this sort of model is the idea of complementarity, so coming back to that idea of diversity of pathways, in order to meet diverse economic and social needs, while also emphasizing the concept of coherence, so a need to take a holistic joint view to policy within this space. So this idea, this model of tertiary education and a systems-based approach is currently being taken forward in a number of different international contexts, and it's worth mentioning now, I think Scotland and Wales, where in Scotland, the Scottish Funding Council is actively pursuing a joined up tertiary system. And in Wales, MEDIR is fundamentally driving a tertiary model. But what I think tertiary education as a phrase therefore means is this fundamental shift from a market-based approach to a systems-based approach, from competition as the mechanism for aligning supply with demand and driving provision, to actually the state taking a more interventionist approach and thinking in terms of systems. This, I think, requires a fundamental shift in the underpinning political philosophy education and training. And that, I think, is something that just needs to be, we need to hang on to that. There is a need for this quite profound shift. And that means that, and I've said this quite a few times in a number of different contexts, but tertiary education should be treated as a political term. But we should treat this term as something that manifests fundamental change, that manifests as a political shift, that is part of a shift from market to systems, removal of competition and a move to coordination. And so when we see more technocratic discourses, this is my view, using a descriptive term to just put things into buckets. So, oh, we're talking about everything that's post-16 is tertiary. We should push back. It should be a political term rather than descriptive. Now, we made this case in a recent report that was rooted in a sort of 4-year large-scale research project comparing the policy approaches across the UK, called From Competition to Coordination, and really made a series of very, very clear recommendations on this transition from competition to coordination and the development of a integrated, holistic tertiary system for England. We worked quite closely with colleagues in DfE on these recommendations through a series of sort of informal chats and formal workshops, as well as some sort of shared projects to really try and embed some of these recommendations into the white paper. Probably these recommendations won't particularly surprise you, and they're far more than this. A very brief sort of overview, but the fundamental shift from market system, so need to frame post-16 using language of a tertiary education system, bearing in mind everything I've said about political aspects of that, a move from competition to coordination, an emphasis on collaboration, complementarity within post-16 education and training, strategic and holistic approach to skills and innovation, so thinking again in terms of systems, linking all of the sort of broader agendas related to education and training and the industrial strategy, broader issues around research and innovation, so to say. Perhaps, not to be dwelt on here just because of the limitations of what I can talk about, but we really emphasise the importance of place, the framing, coordination, not in terms of that overarching centralisation DfE often tends towards, but through mechanisms of evolution. So there's proper regional level coordination, collaboration happens within regions and local economies. And finally, we really recommended the need to reconceptualize the role of employers, so shifting from, as I've described, that employer-led model, one which is much more framed around employer engagement, where there's real meaningful engagement from employers within the education and training system that actually puts some pressure on employers to take responsibility within that system rather than just emphasize employer rights. So, as I said, we put a lot of that into our discussions with DfE on the development of the white paper. And to a certain extent, we were fortunate that it didn't take quite so long to come out, because we could carry on having those conversations. But then the question is, what did it say? Now, as I said, it's a quite large document. It extends over a number of different kinds of ambitions. So I'm not going to go through it in detail. What I'm going to do is just highlight some key issues that I think do come out of it. First one is, perhaps unsurprisingly, given that it's coming from a Labour government, there is way more comfort in talking about the state, the role of the state. The state might intervene and engage much more overtly and actively and strategically within skills system, post-16 education and training space. So there is a tonal change there, which I think is really important. It is overtly signalled in that document. Keywords that really come through this document are system, that's good, ecosystem, collaboration, mentioned repeatedly between a whole wide range of stakeholders, colleges, higher education institutions, between skills and research and innovation. All of that is embedded in the language of this white paper. There's a repeated emphasis on the idea of a joined up skill system, so things coming together, joining up. There's an emphasis on specialization. That word gets used a lot, which my interpretation of it, and speaking with colleagues in DFE, I think this is probably a fair interpretation. It's an attempt to move beyond that or away from that homogenization process that I referred to, and try and re-engage a range of diverse education and training pathways. There is a mention of place. There's an emphasis on place, and that comes through in a whole range of discussions about concepts, local economies, and so on and so forth. And then there's a whole bunch of things about stackable credentials, modular, flexible approaches. There's a very fundamental emphasis on an increase in terms of level 4 and 5, new V levels that are being introduced, and discussion of the standards revolution. There's, I think, indications around some aspects of coordination through language of we will hold sector to account. And there's discussion of data, particularly in relation to the creation of building preceded the white paper, but sort of part of that. So I'll put a few key quotes there, but but I'll move on because time is coming. I'm sure it will 10 minutes. So look, is there anything really different? Yeah. So let's start with the word system. So system is used 131 times in the document. The word market and quasi-market in relation to education and training is never used. So there is a fundamental shift in the language here of what we're talking about. That I think is really important. Flip side of this, the critique that I think is fair is there's no conversation about systems architecture, there's no discussion around systems leaders, there's this sort of continued vague emphasis on regulators. There's not really any fundamental challenge to the role of the OFS within the space, which, let's remember, is the market regulator. And to be honest, I think we see masses of confusion really around the OFS here in what its purpose really is. Perhaps we'll get some clarity when we get a new CEO, but there's just a lack of vision around that role. It's still sort of a bit markety, well, it's still pretty markety. There's not really any sort of coordinating or systems-based role for Skills England or vision or articulation of that for Skills England. So, as our colleague Hewitt Keep has said of this, that there's a rhetorical veneer of systems on all of this, but it's really just sitting on top of what we remain a set of quasi-markets. Personally, I think that that's fair, but also maybe doesn't quite get to the broader issue. It's really important to, I think, acknowledge this discursive change that has happened. Actually talking about systems does matter, in my view. Ultimately, we have a DFE and a DWP and a whole government, which is, largely speaking, populated by a generation of civil servants that are fundamentally embedded in neoliberal discourse. So changing that discourse surely has got to be the first step to actually sort of rolling it out across the sector. So language does matter. I do think language matters. And ultimately, yeah, as I sort of referred to here, we live in this sort of world where I think a lot of people within the post-16 education training system live in a world where neoliberalism and the sort of approach to market is so fundamentally embedded. The idea of change is so alien that it's quite hard to make a jump to that change. So, I think using the analogy of capitalist realism that Fisher draws on is quite appropriate here, where, and similarly, Zizek argues that it's easier for most people living under neoliberalism to capitalism to imagine the end of the world, the end of capitalism. I think in certain parts of the PFP, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of a marketized education and training system. So in order to actually change that, I think it takes time. It takes some element of that shift the discourse first. And so, changing the language, talking about systems is a really important first step. It does matter. Now, I'm just trying to work out what to focus on. There's lots of ways of thinking about the ways in which coordination can be understood as being manifested within this white paper. I think it's worth sort of conceptualizing coordination. It's a word that I've used a lot already, and it's quite slippery. And as I think I've highlighted, quite political. But it's just worth thinking about a framework for conceptualizing coordination. Let's talk about it in three ways. Vertical coordination. So the idea of power across levels. So how a national government might relate to regional and local bodies and institutions. And that sort of understanding of vertical coordination, I think, raises a whole range of key questions about who sets the priorities, who arbitrates between competing claims, who bears the costs of misalignment. I think, broadly speaking, there is elements of this kind of approach to coordination, it's vertical coordination within the white paper. You see it in a number of different sorts of comments. Holding people to account is a good one. But ultimately, structures that are outlined, I think, within the white paper, meaning that there's still a fundamental disconnect between national priorities and institutional autonomy. And it's really represented in, I think, a situation where there's devolved responsibility to probably regions, then the next step down to institutions, but actually no devolved authority. There's no mechanisms within the white paper to devolve authority in a way that would enable meaningful growth. That, I think, is a major challenge that needs to be significant. Second, I think, key strand of thinking about coordination is horizontal. And this is often talked about through the lens of collaboration. So this idea that I've discussed in terms of collaboration between different sectors and institutions within the post-16 space in order to co-produce pathways, create diversity of pathways, reduce duplication, etc., with their provision. The fundamental challenge to collaboration is institutional self-interest, and as our colleague Hazelcorn refers to, I think the tendency for universities to colonize this space. That just exists, and that really requires a constraint on competition. That raises all kinds of questions around incentivizations versus regulation. Are there any solutions to these challenges? Well, there's language around specialization, which perhaps is part of enabling diversity of pathways. There's language around collaboration, but I'm not convinced there's any real implementation plans or any real structures that will actually shift us from competition, from these institutionalized relationships. Maybe there's the rep as a mechanism, maybe the TED, maybe the OFS, maybe LSIPs will do it. The LLE will be the mechanism. But we're not there yet. We haven't got that in the document. So there's a lot still to play for in relation to that horizontal mechanism around coordination. Finally, in terms of the third strand around coordination, there's this issue of functional coordination, what I refer to as functional coordination. So the linking of a skills agenda through systems thinking with a broader economic agenda and social agenda. So we might be able to see this by a combination of education, training, research, innovation, industrial strategy, and labour market institutions all coming together in a kind of coherent, coordinated way. Of course, the challenge around this can be that skills policy becomes a substitute for industrial strategy. Education and training absorbs political costs for economic underperformance. That's been ongoing for decades, essentially. Are there any solutions to this in the white paper? Are there any mechanisms that bring together this sort of functional coordination? Maybe. There is quite a bit of discussion around the industrial strategy. There are links to the industrial strategy. The move of the skills agenda to DWP suggests cross-departmental working. Maybe Skills England is a mechanism for this. So perhaps in this area, there is something that perhaps government is really more leaning into this sort of functional coordination. But there's still way more room to manoeuvre in terms of the political transformation that's required. And ultimately, as an institution, government leans into the status quo, and it's hard to see that sort of model of siloed working really changing. So Gonzalo, you probably want me to end. Let me see if there's anything else I really want to say.
A couple of minutes, I think.
So look, let me just say, I don't think there's any major shift in relation to the role of employers within the white paper. I think that would be that was a really key focus of our research and our advocacy work here. All that we really got is an emphasis on employers investing more in education and training, not engaging more in education and training. And again, I think that transformation is critical to an effective education and training system. We haven't really got that. That's a problem. The other really profound problem is a real lack of focus on lifelong learning, adult education, and the education agenda. Now, I won't dwell on this, but for me, if the state takes a more coordinating role, a greater role in the education and training system, there's an opportunity to step back from a reductive focus on just sort of short-term economic need and think more broadly about wider, longer-term economic needs, longer-term social needs, longer-term individual needs. And a big part of that should be citizenship education, democratic education, that's associated with lifelong learning and adult education. I just want to very briefly say that the Centenary Commission on Adult Education reported in 2019 to celebrate the Reconstruction Report of 1990. So that 1919 report highlighted that there was then a permanent national necessity for lifelong learning in order to support citizenship, to manage what was seen then as profound technological change and the dangers of demagogues, the rise of demagogues at that time. We needed people to be properly educated through a wide range of ways. The Centenary Commission emphasised that point, and I think it's such an important point to make now. It's a point that has lasted 100 years and was probably a return point. it's really disappointing that the white paper didn't engage with this. There is a coordinating role to ensure that there's a proper lifelong learning and adult education strategy. We haven't seen that. So I'll end here. Is the glass half full or half empty in terms of this white paper and the trajectory? I'm going to say that it's actually half full. The white paper maps technical change. It doesn't map meaningful political transformation. But as I said, I think shifting discourse matters. It is a starting point. Transformation does take time, and the sort of move towards say a more coordinated tertiary system takes time. The white paper is the starting point, and there's a lot, I think, still to come in terms of opportunities to operationalize some of these aspirations. But what I think as a sector and an academic and the commentariat need to do is keep emphasizing the importance of a broader political transformation towards a more gender. So that's all I'll end there. And yeah, we can have a conversation about it.
Thank you very much, James, for the presentation. And of course, we have like 16 minutes for questions. I know that Lisa have a question. Lisa?
James, I'll stand up so that people online can hear a bit more effectively. Thank you very much for kicking off its first seminar in what I think is going to be a really engaging and important seminar series. My question is just about the government's white paper. It seems to me that it's a real curate's egg. You know, there's some good stuff and bad stuff, and the problem is that the bad stuff infects the good. And for me, the good stuff is stuff about moving away from market as a method of to a more coordinated approach. That's extremely promising. Another really good thing I thought was in the white paper was a much more pedagogically supportive emphasis for CG. I can never say that. The the exam before A level. A much more supportive, pedagogically supportive orientation to those kids, so that they're not going to be, have failure stamped on their forehead and just put through humiliation and torture, through having to resit their exams. I thought all that's good, but the problem with it is that even while it's moving away from market mechanisms, the what of education is a particularly narrow version, even more so than in previous iterations of policy, with its focus on skill. No longer is skill just contained to the vocational education sector. Higher education is completely subsumed in this skills agenda. It makes human capital theory look positively expansive. It's focused, it's narrow focus on skill. So I'm just wondering, to what like on the one hand, it's moving away from market mechanisms towards more coordinated mechanisms, which is great. But on the other hand, it seems to me that there is a narrowing and an increase of control over the what of education, and that's deeply concerning.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I think that sort of reduction to the economic purposes and very short-term economic purposes of education through the language of primarily life skills is problematic, and that's why I genuinely think if we were to grasp the nettle and take a way more coordinated approach, that is the mechanism to actually talk about the broader issues in the educational agenda that should be part of this. However, I can see why it happened. It's rooted in the fact that DfE had to produce a document that was linked with the growth mission, and then to a lesser extent the opportunity mission. There's not much room in that sort of quite instrumental direct approach for talking more philosophically about the broader approaches to education. So again, glass half full. I don't necessarily think that there's an absence of people within the sector who are talking about the educational agenda and the wider issues. It's just that the document inevitably is framed around skills and the economy. Doesn't mean that it's still not a big part of the discourse. I still think that, yeah, again, in normative terms, it's our role as academics and educators to make sure that that education agenda remains really vital within the policy discourse. And I'll do a quick plug now, which is Paul Ashwin. I don't know if he's in.
Yes.
Paul and I, with a really strong steering group, actually from people across the sector, are putting together a seminar series which will run between now and July on the educational agenda and how we can actually bring a critical discussion of the education agenda into meaningful dialogue with the skills agenda, so that we can sort of problematize some of those policies. So everybody watch out for publicity around that coming soon.
We had another question here in the room, and then we are going to go with Edward and Mark. But please.
Hi. Analysing go. I thought just to sort of, I'd be really interested to concretize this in an area where you and I obviously know about, which is sort of farming. Because I'm sort of worried. I mean, I'm right with you on the post-marketisation systems, all that thing, but there is a question for me over the, I suppose, the dominance of the state. Because, I mean, if you take farming, obviously, DEFRA is fully focused on keeping the status quo and the mainstream farmers happy and so forth. And whereas obviously innovation, where the skills, regen farming, agroecological farming, et cetera, who don't expect actually any skills or training in the institutions that exist. It's all peer group learning, etc. And a government given the lead on this will make no difference. That might even make it worse in some ways because of the political demands on them and so forth. And to generalize from that, governments tend to be really very much in the here and now. So, and education, in my understanding, if we put skills within education, broaden that a little bit, is meant to be more sort of inclusive, longer term, more about community, wider civil society, etc. So, your system or the system where government sort of is the core, the center of the web, the determining the direction, is that, even if it's better than quasi-marketisation, is it really where you want to get to? Because it seems to have a lot of downsides potentially as well.
Yeah, thanks, Henry. I think it's a really fair and important point that central coordination is can lead to quite profound stagnation, like lack of agility, and that wasn't what I was advocating for, and I didn't explain myself clearly enough. But if you were to read the sort of from competition to coordination report that we did, there's a real emphasis there on coordination having a devolved role. So both a systems-based approach and a devolved role where place matters, and so there's a role for local authorities, to wider sort of regional economic stakeholders to play a more agile coordinating role with government and central government, setting parameters and frameworks to support that, but not necessarily being the cold dead hand steering. So in terms of farming, it's really interesting, because it sort of it cuts across in a kind of fascinating, awkward way that is very place-based, but also is actually very national as well. And my view here is the critical aspect is systems thinking. So actually, if you think about innovation within farming, there's actually a lot of skills-based work within the innovation world. So people that are doing projects through Innovate UK are, often creating a sort of shadow skill system that sits alongside the mainstream skill system that drives forward innovative work and activity. I would be really interested in seeing what's going on in those terms, in the innovation space and in farming. My suspicion is that there is a lot of skills-based work that's going on in relation to innovation that could still be linked up through coordinating regional mechanisms like LSEVs. It's also possible that organisations like Lantra, and I think I saw a Lantra colleague in the room somewhere, but are part of that piece as well, part of the sort of broader coordinating mechanism by providing a sector view on skills needs, enabling both the sort of skill system and the sector to respond and coordinate and collaborate in a more fair. Bit of a ramble, sorry, but we can maybe
Anywhere?
Hi, thanks James for the seminar. Really interesting, and I think the series as a whole is going to be fascinating. So can I mention two words that I think are probably going to dominate a lot of the discussion in this seminar, but also the subsequent ones, and that's called funding mechanism. Two critical words that actually drive behaviour. Vice Chancellors sometimes say that they're driven by philosophical beliefs or values, but actually, in my experience, the only thing that really makes Vice Chancellors and FE college principals act differently is the promise of cash. So I guess the question I have is, do you think you can have systems behaviour and systems thinking in England with the current funding mechanisms we have?
Thanks, Hewitt. Oh, you're right. Money is critical here. Yeah, so my answer is no. But I'd be really interested, sorry to turn this on you, in your answer, actually, given that you're working on this from a Scottish Funding Council perspective. It might be interesting to hear what the solution is to funding mechanisms in Scotland.
Well,
lots of money there.
Well, the answer, I think, is that basically you don't have all your funding individualised and following individual student choice. So basically you have block grant funding, which requires a funding council. But the Scottish Government has decided it's going to review the entire funding of higher education in Scotland. And there are plenty of people, including Vice-Chancellors, who want to go down the English route. So watch this space. But I think the thing is that if cash is solely tied to individual student choice, then the competition for students drives and the putting on of an offer that will attract students rather than an offer that's linked to skill needs in the wider economy is really, really problematic. So some kind of block grant funding, it doesn't have to all be block grant funding, but my response is without block grant funding, which is tied to a set of objectives, certainly in Scotland, and targets. Without that, getting people and institutions to behave differently, it really is an uphill struggle. And that's what I'm guessing.
Please.
This is my world. I literally live in this world in my day job. And actually, I literally wrote that paragraph this afternoon whilst I was sat in the canteen. So that's amazing that you've said that. It's interesting, actually, because the new Labour government, we've talked a lot about, and you talked about function on one of your slides. And almost the first opportunity that Labour have had to do some work, they've gone with function. So they've created an opportunity for colleges to apply for technical excellence colleges, 200 colleges in the country, 20 techs. So suddenly we create competition. It's about function, so we'll be able to work with universities and employers and do brilliant, brilliant work. But now we're competing against each other. So immediately we've created chaos. Everybody's gone into secret squirrel mode. Nobody's talking to each other, and it's just created chaos again. So there is, I don't know if we're ever going to be able to achieve it, because it's kind of natural to kind of want to do the best for your region, and nobody talks to each other. I think we're a generation away from getting from competition to collaboration, but there are green roots to it. There's definitely some progress being made. in the last maybe year and a half, 2 years.
Yeah, really useful.
I know that we have more questions probably online and here in the room, but I think we are gonna go with the last one, and then the people in the room can ask after the time. But Mark, if you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to kind of ask a question a little bit about devolution and place-based policy, and whether you know, the sphere of devolution actually opens up now an opportunity for colleges to adapt policy, and particularly adapt this white paper, because the white paper, as you said, is, you know, it's very wide and broad, and the government's intention is to move towards a more devolved model. So will devolution offer a kind of possibility of getting to a place where colleges are able to offer very distinct local offers?
Yeah, I think this is key. So my view is, yes, it could do. And if we want to be normative, then yes, it absolutely should do. I think devolution is the opportunity here to create meaningful regional tertiary systems that actually enable that sort of place-based collaboration. Collaboration is such a sort of easy word to throw around, but actually it really only makes sense, I think, at a place-based level, where colleges can, you know, talk to each other, where colleges can talk to universities, where there are regional employers in the mix. So I think that is the key mechanism for making this work. I don't know if we've got actually anyone from DFE here in the room. But when I did ask Jackie Smith about this, I think the sort of DFE and DWP view was that, oh yeah, the key lever for driving place-based collaboration through devolution mechanisms is the LSIP review over the summer. I'm not sure about that. You know, maybe. I think if regions take that as an opportunity to really look carefully at the structures of the region and the skills needs of the region, then maybe that's an opportunity to drive it. Without, you know, in Europe's terms, better funding mechanisms to shift that and better incentives to drive that, I think it could flounder. But I do think the opportunity is there.
I think devolved local authorities have got a better chance because they've got a better convening power than if you're not sat in a devolved local authority. So certainly, I've moved to an area that devolved it's a mayoral combined authority, and actually they meet regularly with their whole group of people, and we sit around the table talking. That's completely different to other areas that don't have that. So I think there's a strong chance that will work.
Well, thank you very much, James, for your presentation. It's been a very nice discussion as well. Thank you very much, everyone, for your questions. And here we are sharing the calendar of the following seminars. Next week we have Professor Anne-Marie Bathmaker from the University of Birmingham, and his seminar is titled "Thinking with Bourdieu to Consider the Potential and Pitfalls of Tertiary Education System in England." So it's going to be a very interesting discussion on some theoretical tools in order to also analyze this policy change. So thank you very much, and we really hope to see you next week and in the following seminars.